What I'll be talking about ends up to be a kind of a downer in some ways. I'll be talking about sort of depressing developments in Mongolia since 1990. But I will try to speculate about the future. And to my mind, the future is rosier than the presentation I'll make. I do believe there are some extraordinarily competent Mongolians who, if they take charge, if they become dominant in a variety of areas, government, law, social system, will bring to Mongolia the kind of government and the kind of society that they deserve. So let me start with what happened to the Mongols after 1368. Sort of nobody really focuses on that. What happened to why did the Mongol Empire really collapse? Well, it collapsed mostly for internal reasons. It fragmented, and there was disunity among the various Mongol khanates. They really weren't defeated so much as their own disunity led to the end of the Mongol Empire in China, in Iran, and in Russia. There were attempts in the 15th, after they had left China in particular, many of them wound up in Mongolia. In the 15th and 16th centuries, there were leaders who arose, tried to unify the population, didn't work. Finally, in the 1570s, one leader, one Khan, came up with the idea of trying to use religious unity as a means of providing political unity. He invited a figure from Tibet, a cleric from Tibet, to come and proselytize and teach about Tibetan Buddhism, thinking that would translate into political unity. Well, the figure who came up was very successful. He did teach and preach about Tibetan Buddhism, and much of the population eventually, by the late 17th century, had become Tibetan Buddhists. But that, unfortunately, did not lead to political unity. There was still fragmentation. And just to give you an idea of the kind of fragmentation that has occurred in Mongolia, when Mongolia had its first free election in 1990, with a population of 2 million, there were over 20 political parties. And this is kind of typical of what has happened in Mongolia and what happens traditionally. There is a drive towards individual glory and not so much political unity. Didn't work, they didn't unify, and so when the Qing dynasty comes to power in 1644, there is no unity in Mongolia, and eventually in 1691, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into, China takes over Mongolia, eastern Mongolia, and then eventually by the 1750s, they take over all of Mongolia. And that has led to many of the contemporary problems. The Mongols believe that the period from 1691 till the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911 was a period of great exploitation by the Chinese and the Manchus. They feel that the Qing dynasty was oppressive. Much of Mongolia eventually became indebted to Chinese merchants and Chinese officials. And unlike Xinjiang, where there was cooperation that led to rebellion against China, against the Qing, that did not happen pretty much in Mongolia. The Mongols couldn't come together and unite in any sort of way to challenge Qing dynasty rule, and so they exaggerated to a certain extent about the oppression of the Chinese because they couldn't do much about it. 1911, the Qing dynasty collapses, and there is an opportunity for the Mongols to move towards independence. It doesn't happen. Again, from 1911 to 1921, they couldn't unite in any sort of way to bring about a new system, a new independence policy. The head of the Mongolian Buddhist establishment tried for a brief period to become the secular leader, but in fact he was an alcoholic, syphilitic, and that didn't help in terms of uniting the population. And so a lot of different groups tried in that 10-year period to take advantage of the disarray in Mongolia, Chinese warlords, white Russians, Japanese, all sorts of people, including a very strange Russian named Ungern von Sternberg, who professed to be very interested in Buddhism, but and for a brief period took charge of the capital city in 1920, 1921, but was a total disaster. He was mostly a killer. At first, the Mongols were very much taken with his ability and the fact that he was interested in Buddhism, but very shortly thereafter, they realized that he hated everybody. He was an anti-Semite, he was an anti-black, anti-Mongol, and so eventually they had to turn to someone else. And there was no one else to turn to but the Soviet Union at that point. In 1921, a group of Mongols sought to bring the Soviet Union into Mongolia to crush this Ungern von Sternberg. And most of those leaders were not communists at all. They had no idea what communism was all about. They simply thought that the Soviet Union could help them break away from China and at the same time destroy Ungern von Sternberg. The original leaders who were portrayed during the communist period as staunch communists had no idea what communism was all about. Marx had never been translated into Mongolian. Most of these folks didn't know anything but Mongolian, and so they thought of the Soviet Union not as a communist state, but as an ally that could help them achieve independence. Soviets are successful, and 1921, Mongolia becomes the second communist state in the world. The period from 1921 to 1990 is a period in which there's considerable Soviet influence, and some people say Soviet domination in Mongolia. It's a period of horrible purges on the one hand. Mongolia modeled its policies in large part on what was going on in the Soviet Union. So in the late 1930s, you have terrible purges of monks, particularly monks, probably as many as 50,000, 40 to 50,000 people were killed during that period. Monasteries were destroyed. Monastic art was also either stolen or destroyed, and it was a horrible period. There were terrible human rights violations from 21 to 1990 by the Mongolian government. Mongolians followed the policies of the Soviet Union 6 months later, so that when collectivization began in 1928 in the Soviet Union, the Mongols tried to do the same thing 6 months later. It didn't work in Mongolia. They had to abandon the collectivization because the herders simply would not go along with it. They wanted their own private animals and would not in any way turn their animals over to the big collectives. Eventually, the Mongols gave that up in 1932. And so the period is portrayed as a relatively negative period, as a very negative period in most histories. On the other hand, the Soviets did bring modern education into Mongolia. They brought a modern rudimentary health system in Mongolia. They brought in cultural developments. The Mongolian ballet, the Mongolian opera were the Soviet Union was pretty much dominant during that period. China still proclaimed itself to be proclaimed that Mongolia was part of China. Even Mao Zedong, in talks with the journalist Edgar Snow, the very renowned journalist Edgar Snow, said that Mongolia would eventually be part of China. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek felt the same way. And so the Mongols were very fearful of that happening. They believed that that would simply mirror what happened in the period from 1691 to 1911. There'd be the same kind of oppression from their standpoint by China. 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union put a lot of pressure on Chiang Kai-shek to accept Mongolia as an independent country, or at least to allow a plebiscite, a vote in Mongolia to determine whether the Mongols wanted to be independent or whether they still wanted to be under Chinese control. The reason was very simple. The United States wanted Soviet involvement in the Far East. They wanted the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan. Nobody knew about the nuclear bomb at that point, whether the nuclear bomb would be effective, and they thought that there would have to be a land invasion of Japan, and there would be tremendous casualties. So the idea developed that the Soviet Union would be involved as well, and they would sustain some of the casualties. That was the reason why there was pressure on Chiang Kai-shek to agree to a plebiscite. Lo and behold, there was a plebiscite, and 99.99% voted for independence. That was changed. Chiang Kai-shek accepted that, but in 1947 he renounced it, saying that the Mongolians had tried to move into Xinjiang and border conflicts arose, and so Chiang Kai-shek sort of gave up the desire to take over and the right to take over for the Mongols to be independent. And so that was the story as of the time of the People's Republic of China, 1949. In 1949, Stalin invites Mao Zedong to Moscow, and he puts tremendous pressure on Mao to accept the idea of Mongolia as an independent country. In 1950, Mao Zedong acknowledges that Mongolia is an independent country. And at that point, treaties were signed between China and Mongolia, by which the Chinese committed themselves to provide economic assistance to Mongolia. The main form of economic assistance was labor. If Mongolia was to make a dramatic stride forward industrially and to build up its infrastructure, it needed labor. And one of the things that Mongolia did not have was people. Mongolia is the least, even today, is the least densely populated country in the world. At that point, it had less than 2 million people. So if you're going to start these big infrastructure projects, building of roads, building of all sorts of, construction of all sorts of buildings in the capital city, making the capital city a real capital city, you require workers. Chinese sent workers. The Soviets provided economic and technical assistance. And so the period from 50 to 58 witnessed a tremendous development in Mongolia. Apartment buildings were set up, roads were built, railroad was begun, and so on and so forth. Everything was going terrifically well, until the Sino-Soviet split. In 1958 was the beginning of disputes, ideological disputes, territorial disputes, foreign policy disputes between China and the Soviet Union. The question was, where would Mongolia how would Mongolia decide which group to join? It was obvious. In 1964, they kicked out all of the Chinese workers. They sided with the Soviet Union. They felt the Soviet Union had the economic wherewithal, the technical assistance that they needed. Many of the top leaders had studied in the Soviet Union in the 40s, 50s, 60s. The president of the country was married to a Russian woman. And so all of those factors came into play, and in 64, the Mongolians sided with the Soviet Union. From that period till the late 1980s, considerable animosities between the Chinese government and the Mongolian government. Anything that went wrong in Mongolia was blamed on the Chinese. They criticized the Chinese policy in Vietnam. They criticized the Cultural Revolution. They criticized the policy of the Chinese towards Inner Mongolia, while at the same time the Chinese were criticizing the Mongolians for giving away all of their great mineral resources to the Soviet Union for almost no money, for a pittance, for allowing Russians to do anything they wanted in Mongolia. And there was some factual basis for both. I remember when I first went to Mongolia, we were told not to go out at night because we would be thought of as Russians. And there was a lot of hostility towards the Russians in the 1970s. Even though Mongolia depended upon Russian economic assistance and Russian technical assistance, the Russians had a privileged kind of situation in Mongolia. They had special shops where they could buy things and products that no Mongol could buy. And they were thought to be arrogant towards Mongolians. They got higher wages than the Mongolians. And so there was a real animosity and hostility towards Russians. Almost no Chinese. And in terms of Mongol attitudes towards China, it is true that quite a few Mongolians died during the Cultural Revolution. There was a real kind of violence that was sanctioned against Mongols in Inner Mongolia. It's claimed that somewhere around 25,000 Mongolians, at least 25,000 Mongolians, were killed during the Cultural Revolution. That was just that kind of animosity prevented any sort of interaction between the Chinese and the Mongols. The 1980s, when Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union in 1985, he brought with him a different policy towards China. He initiated a kind of agreement with the Chinese in various areas, less hostility than had been the fact before. Territorial disputes that had undermined them were forgiven and resolved. And most important, the Soviets, during the period of conflict with China, had placed over 100,000 troops in Mongolia to fend off a reputed attack from the Chinese in Mongolia. He began withdrawing those 100,000 troops. By 1990, nearly all Soviet troops were out. The Soviet Union was in a bad way, was about to collapse. Its economy could not provide the kind of economic assistance that had been the case before. And their Mongolians recognized this. They had traded, 90% of their trade in the Soviet period had been with the Soviet Union or the Eastern European bloc. Almost nothing with China. What do you do in 1990? You, first of all, breaking away from the communist bloc leads in March of 1990 to the collapse of communism in Mongolia. The first independent election is scheduled to take place in July, a multi-party election, not just the Communist Party, but a whole series of parties. In fact, as I said, over 20 of them. In July of 1990, the communists, unbelievably enough, win in 1990, July of 1990, because the people who had gone against communism, these young, mostly young intellectuals, had no support in the countryside. They had no great political skills. They were basically city folks who had no conception of country life, basically, and many of them had studied in the Soviet Union, had lost whatever connection they had with Mongolia, and so the Mongolian Communist Party won in 1990. But it recognized that the Soviet Union could no longer be its protector and could no longer be its supporter. So they had a number of choices as to who would provide economic assistance, who would provide a trade, would be a trade partner, who would be a technical assistant. They had, first of all, China. That was totally precluded because of the history of Chinese Mongolian relations from 1691 on. They mistrusted the Chinese. As I said, practically everything that went wrong in Mongolia was blamed upon the Chinese. They would have liked to continue with Russia. And what's fascinating to me, despite all of the terrible disasters, the purges, the murders, the sort of animosity towards the Russians, even today, there have been surveys taken over the past 20 years, 25 years, what is the country that Mongolia should depend upon? 80% say Russia. That's just a fact. They associate Russia with a better period in terms of their history. 1990 to the present has witnessed a lot of serious problems. There's been a wild ride to capitalism, as Fortune magazine points out. Russia's gone, it can't provide the help. China, they're not willing to deal with. They turn to the international financial agencies, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank. And at that point, one of my colleagues, one of my present colleagues, a man named Jeffrey Sachs, was proposing the idea of shock therapy as a way to bring about a move from communism to a market economy. And what that meant was to basically minimize the role of government, cut it back dramatically, get rid of state enterprises, put the government out of the economy, get rid of subsidies that had been provided to Mongolian citizens in terms of welfare and other things. Get rid of subsidies for food, get rid of subsidies for other essentials, and to move dramatically and immediately towards a market economy without preparation. The problem was that much of the population had no idea what a market economy was all about. Nothing, no conception. And in fact, I should say that Sachs, I just had a meeting with him about a couple of months ago. He's changed his tune entirely. He believes that he made a mistake in terms of proposing this idea of shock therapy. Shock therapy also meant reduction in payments for health, education, social welfare, and subsidies for electricity and heating, which are vital in the capital city of Mongolia. The prices went sky high in the 1990s. So it turned out that this kind of policy led to austerity for the poor, and those people who knew about a market economy or who had connections built up over the years were able to do extremely well. And there are extraordinary number of, not extraordinary, but there are a number of millionaires and billionaires in Mongolia at the moment. Income inequality has grown dramatically. There's a Louis Vuitton in the main square in Mongolia, while people outside are begging. There's a Shangri-La hotel right across the street, so on and so forth. So some people have done very well. Most of the population has not done well at all. Some of the best things that the Soviets had done, or the Mongolian communists had done, education and health were devastated. The amount of money allocated to education was reduced considerably. Dropouts, school dropouts, for the first time. Street children in Mongolia, as parents lost their income, were made unemployment because of the cutbacks in state factories and state enterprises. Tremendous unemployment soared. And the policies that were brought about by these advisors who came from the World Bank, from the IMF, from American agencies such as the Agency for International Development, were really crackpot. One of the things that that I witnessed was in 1998. A so-called pension expert was brought by the Agency for International Development to Mongolia. And the Mongols had, under the communist period, had provided a small pension payment to the elderly, even in the countryside, even herders, so that they wouldn't have to depend upon their kids. And that payment was regular, was part of a defined benefit that these herders would get. It amounted to about 2 to 3% of the gross domestic product, not an enormous amount. This pension expert comes in, spends 2 weeks in Mongolia, as did many of these advisors. They spent almost no time, and always in the city. They never went out in the countryside, or very, very rarely. He proposes the idea of, instead of having a defined benefit, you have a contributory benefit. In other words, the herder, let's say, would put a certain amount of money into his pension and would decide where it would be invested. So I had lunch with this guy, and my wife and I actually had, and said, how would this work? Well, he said they'd invest in the Mongolian Stock Exchange. Mongolian Stock Exchange at that point in '98 met once a week and had almost no important dealings. I pointed this out to him. Unbelievably, he didn't know. And he said, well, they could invest in the New York Stock Exchange or London or Chicago. Could you imagine a herder living 600 miles from Nowheresville deciding whether he would invest in Xerox or who knows, Johnson & Johnson or whatever else? It was crazy, crackpot. But in terms of China, what they did, which was also devastating, they emphasized liberalization in trade. And so as of May 1st, 1997, the Mongols reduced or almost totally eliminated tariffs. This was another brilliant idea. You've got one of the great economies of the world, one of the dynamic economies in the 1990s, right next door, and you opened up the country to Chinese products without a tariff, without protecting infant industries, which was crazy. The result is that industries that you should have in Mongolia, a leather industry, they have a ton of animals. They should have a leather industry. They should have a boot industry. They should have a cashmere industry. 20% of the world's cashmere, raw cashmere, is produced in Mongolia, some of the best quality. What happens is that Inner Mongolian or Chinese traders, what happened originally, would go into Mongolia and they would offer the herders more money than the cashmere processors in Mongolia could provide them with. And so they came out with a lot of the raw cashmere. There was a shortage for a while, around 2000 AD, of raw cashmere for Mongolian cashmere processors. And the big money, of course, goes when you produce a sweater or you produce a scarf or whatever. So the herders were getting slightly better income, but not dramatically so, while the big money was going to elsewhere. As time went on, Chinese investment came in, and China is now the largest investor in Mongolia. It's also, in terms of trade turnover, it has the largest trade turnover of any country, by far. And so increasingly, as a result of these policies, which were devised actually by the Western world, by the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, ironically, the group that's profited the most has been the Chinese, which is sort of staggering in a way. Obviously, Mongolia would have to trade a lot with China, but they could have had protection to an extent in terms of the industries that they could have an advantage in that simply don't exist anymore in Mongolia. They depended, the advisors to the Mongolian government depended on the mineral resources, mineral and natural resources that the Mongols had. They thought that that was the way to go and not necessarily to protect a small number of industries. And so Mongolia has become increasingly dependent on minerals. And minerals go up and down. Minerals particularly sold to China. Most of the minerals are found along the Gobi Desert, the southern part of Mongolia, and right next door is China. So they became increasingly dependent, and for a while, it seemed like a good thing. In 2011, 2012, because of mineral exports of copper, gold, to a limited extent, uranium, coal, the Mongolian economy grew very rapidly. But it sank precipitously very shortly thereafter as the Chinese no longer bought their copper, gold, and other coal and other commodities. And now they're in a kind of, Mongolia is in a kind of depression. The Mongolians were vulnerable to sort of crooked types from a lot of different places, a lot of different countries. One of the most crooked was a guy named Toxic Bob, a man named Robert Friedland, who happened to be at Reed College at the same time as Steve Jobs. Jobs and Friedland were very good buddies, and they both had this spiritual call. They both went to India for a while and had, I don't know, some spiritual regeneration or whatever. And, but they both gave up their spiritual regeneration and moved into the secular world and made a ton of money. Toxic Bob was a mineral guy. And for what he did on the Colorado River, the pollution that his mines released into the Colorado River, he had the largest EPA fine in U.S. history. What he did basically was to go to Canada and become a Canadian citizen, and he paid only a pittance of that fine. So he goes to Mongolia and probably bribes a whole bunch of people and gets access to one of the richest sources of copper and gold in Mongolia along the Gobi Desert, someplace called Oyu Tolgoi, and plays it up to investors in 2005. He's recorded as saying that it doesn't matter about the environment, the Mongols don't care about the environment, I don't care about the environment, in terms of, this is recorded in a pitch to investors that he did in Florida. And he says, oh, the taxes, I've done a deal that there'll only be 5 to 6% taxes in 10 years, and we're already have taken out a ton of profits. And he says, we have a robust profit margin of 95%. 5% goes to the Mongols, 95% to us. Well, the Mongols were not crazy about this, and he's eventually sold his interest, much of his interest, to one of the big, giant British-Australian companies, Rio Tinto. Chinese have done the same thing. There have been mining companies, Chinese mining companies who have also done devastating things to the Mongolian environment. They have not abided by environmental regulations. They have not abided by prices, have not abided by taxes to the government, royalties, and so on and so forth. So it's been a point of conflict. What have the Mongols done in terms of both China and the West? Well, one of the problems is tremendous corruption. Mongolia is awash in corruption. At one point, a few years ago, the president of Mongolia was in jail for taking bribes and for doing all sorts of other things that undermine the economy. It's had some relatively poor leadership on the very top level. The latest president, the one who just ended his presidency last year, in June of 1917, he'd been president for 8 years. I met him in 1994, and I'm just amazed that he had, somehow or other had hoodwinked his way into an important position in government. Somehow or other, some American advisor got him accepted for a while at the Kennedy School at Harvard. It was incredible. How he managed a month in that school, I don't know. The Mongols have a little story about him, the Mongol elite, intellectual elite. According to the story, around 2150, people can go into a store and buy brains. So guy goes into a store and he says, whose brain is that? Albert Einstein. How much is that? $25. Goes to the next brain. That's the president of Mongolia in 2000 or so AD. His brain is worth $40,000. Guy says, that's impossible. Einstein was one of the great geniuses. How could that be? And he said, well, Einstein's brain was used. That's the problem. In terms of China has everything you see. Consumer goods of all sorts mostly come from China. In Mongolia, blankets, toothpaste, everything that you can think of. The Chinese dominate the cashmere market in Mongolia. Mining has gone down terribly over the past 5 or 6 years. What is the solution here? I don't know. The present president that Clay was talking about got most of his training as a sumo specialist. He's accused of money laundering. He built the second largest, or was owned the second largest hotel in the capital city. There are a lot of hanky-panky that he probably was involved with. So unless something is done to control the corruption that pervades the government, that pervades nearly every institution, I've heard stories, repeated stories about parents paying one of their high school teachers to give their kids a higher grade so that they can enter university, payment to doctors, all sorts of things that have come to light. Customs officers being bribed and eventually being jailed. The starting of casinos, again, a lot of bribery, a lot of graft involved in that. That seems to me to be the main impediment to a more modern Mongolia and to a better relationship with its neighbors, both China and Russia. Whether they will do that, I don't know. Every year seems to get worse in terms of the country. They now have a population of about 3 million, about half in the capital city. The herding economy has been devastated by the policies that were initiated in 1990. They got rid of cooperatives that had worked out pretty well, actually. They were set up in the 1950s. Cooperatives where herders would get a salary rather than would depend upon selling their animals necessarily. They would get a salary from the co-op. The co-op provided them with climate information. The co-op would provide them with trucks so that they could market their animals to the cities and towns. The co-ops worked pretty well. And pooling of labor works in this kind of herding economy. They were told to get rid of the collectives, and so they did so very quickly. Some people made out like bandits. Some of the well-connected people took the trucks, took the most important, the best animals, and did the best. But the large majority of herders were left with very little. You need about 150 animals to be able to survive on a consistent basis in Mongolia. Many of them did not have that. And in addition to that, Mongolia faces the dreaded Zud, that is terrible winters that come up quite frequently, usually about once every 4 or 5 years. But in one case, from 1999 to 2002, there were 3 successive disastrous winters. And the census of animals collapsed. I mean, there was 33 million animals in 1999. There were about 19 million in 2002. There have been Zuds ever since, and the result is that these herders are moving into the city. They've given up herding, and they enter these so-called ger quarters surrounding the capital city. They live in tents. Usually no running water, sort of general electricity. Sanitation is terrible. Garbage is often not picked up. And the result is that you have a real pauper population around the cities. And again, there are all sorts of campaigns to rectify this, but in general, there's so much corruption that it doesn't happen terribly much. The situation is kind of drastic in many ways. What's the solution? The solution, as I say, is to work on corruption. And secondly, I have great faith in the new leadership of Mongolia, the new younger people who are potential leaders. There are really brilliant young people, mostly women, who are dedicated to the country and who might be able to evade and avoid the kind of graft-ridden government, graft-ridden economy that has existed in Mongolia for the past 20 years or so. The women, by and large, are the most educated. It's now something like 75% of the college students are women, much higher percentage than almost any place in the world. And they are incredible, some of them. One whom I particularly admire is a woman who was foreign minister for a while and was also environmental minister, one of the few incorruptible parliamentary figures. One would hope that she would eventually become the prime minister. But she has one thing that holds her up. Her grandfather was Russian. And there still is some animosity about, or some hostility towards Mongols who are not totally pure. And so whether that's holding her up, I don't know, but I have a sneaking suspicion, and she does too, that is part of her inability to reach the very top level of government. She's very smart. She has a PhD in geology from Cambridge. Her brother, who was assassinated, was one of the leaders of the democracy movement. She came to my class at Columbia in March last year and really gave us an astounding speech without notes, and brilliant woman. So there are people like that, and we just, if those people move towards important political positions and social positions and economic positions, you would have a different Mongolia, and that's what I'm hoping for. I hope, I said that I would end off on an optimistic note, and I'm very optimistic that that might very well be the case. So let me stop here, and if you have questions or comments, I'd be glad to take them.